Traveling in slow motion, paddling with no question. Early morning with the sun, not yet burning, innocent. I try to be a good son, myself 100%. Oh. I feel it inside. I wanna reach that. It's somewhere inside. I wish I reached that. Skyline.
Eh bien, bonjour donc.
Hello again. Thank you for your. Thank you that you're also numerous. This is the last round table that resist why and against whom. This is a wide subject because resistance, they are very diverse and they've changed over time. This morning I heard that some mayors from Brittany were resisting against the state because of the bad state of their retirement home. This morning we heard a Iranian mother who was resisting against the death penalty because her daughter was executed. I was speaking with Armenian. We were talking about the Karabakh region, the Nagorno-Karabakh region. We worked with a web series from the INA, and we're going to show you 3 episodes that are going to guide us in our discussions, and then we'll ask you to react every time on these 3 episodes. And I have the luck with me to have Eve Minot, who is the director of this web series.
Nous avons aussi avec nous Kléber Haroul, le directeur du mémorial.
We also have Kléber Haroul, the head director of the Mémorial de Caen.
Et nous avons
And we have also Bertrand Badi, which of course everybody knows, emeritus teacher at Political Science Institute, and who is an expert on these topics, who is going to enlighten us on this.
Donc, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, les résistances aujourd'hui, elles sont diverses.
Resistance today, they are very diverse. That's why we have chosen these 3 movies that are going to illustrate these 3 ways of resisting.
Sur l'enjeu environnemental. Donc,
the second on women and the third on environmental matters. So let's get started with the first one. Eve, tell us about how you made this film, what happened, and we'll talk about the impact of these films, and then we open to Q&A. So let's get started with the first episode.
La résistance permet au peuple de se défendre.
Resistance allows people to defend themselves against invaders who want to impose their domination. Citizens take up arms, citizens who never imagined joining the battlefield. It forces men and women to defend their identity, to take control of their destiny.
Dès l'invasion russe en
As soon as Russia invaded in February 2022, Ukraine decided to defend itself. I'm 73, but if the Russians come, I will take up arms and I will go to the front. I am a woman. I'm not a warrior who wants to go and fight, but I'll do everything I can to help my country and to help my army. 1 year later, Ukraine has taken back a lot of the territory that was lost and has destroyed half of Moscow's tanks. but the Ukrainian resistance has come at a cost. Since the beginning of the conflict, civilians and soldiers have lost their lives trying to defend their country, sometimes in terrible conditions, such as in Bucha and Mariupol. Over 85 years ago, France was facing an invader. After its army was defeated in 1940, General de Gaulle called upon the French people to resist, faced with the German occupier. I call upon all the French people who want to stay free to listen to me and to follow me. Long live France. Let's live in honor and independence. To bother the Germans, the French resistance sabotaged factories, train lines, and gave information to countries like Great Britain that continued to fight against Germany. They invited people to join the French Free Forces in the UK. How many of them took the risk of dying to defend their country? These volunteers of all different ages believed in a better country and opposed Nazi Germany. Once the Second World War ended, the idea of the rights of people and nations to be free progressed on the international scale. After decolonization, choices decided to stand up without states and without armies to demand their right to independence, from Asia to Black Africa, following via going via the Middle East and the Maghreb, the North African region. Fight was taken in big cities as also in rural areas. All across the globe, resistances continue to exist. There are no areas, nations, which can create peace without the support of the citizens. Resistance as a form of coexistence.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We can see through this first episode how the topics are very diverse and the topic is very wide. We're going to start with Eve, how this work on the archives with the National Audiovisual Institute, how do you select it? There's many resistance movements over time and even over the last decades. Yes, that was the main issue of this series, was to define what we're going to speak about and how we are going to link the today's resistance with yesterday's resistance, because at the INA we work mainly with archives, also to valorize the INA archives. Start from today, the situation, say, where are the resistance hotspots? We discussed this with Monsieur Badi, and we had identified the links that we can have between today and yesterday, and we thought about Ukraine to represent this armed resistance to invasion. So we started with Ukraine, and then we followed the mythical figure of the French resistance, particularly in Normandy. This has a specific meaning. And then we went back. It's back and forth. It's quite delicate. But for me, there was a certain coherence to telling of the topic of self-determination of the people after World War II, and that really places France in another role, that of the oppressor in Algeria and the decolonization, and to show that the roles can also change, and that a resistant can become an oppressor and vice versa, and that this resistance is really the logic of people to defend themselves. Bertrand Badi, how do you establish a link between all these resistance? There are resistance which you know well, Kurdistan, Palestine, but how do you make the link with the Ukrainian example that appeared on the stage these last months? Well, when we prepared it, I was a small cog in this entire machine. I had the easiest part. I was just the advisor, and then so I really would like to salute the extraordinary quality of this film, because I did not do it, so I'm allowed to do it. But these exchanges that we had, Eve and I, the approach, the reflection, about 1 year of preparation of this Forum of Normandy for Peace has brought me to something that I was able to verify in the first documentary that we've just seen. It's the extraordinary similarity between all the resistance movements. There really is a type, a resistance of time, a common denominator in extremely diverse situations. It's extraordinary to have put side by side the French resistance, decolonization, Ukraine. Um, what is there behind all that? First of all, there is a message from a fantastic optimism. That is really the matrix of not only of these movies, but also of these 2 days of forum. And it's really extraordinary that this movie reflects the state of mind, is that humans are not machines, that there is fundamentally at the heart of every one of us an absolute desire for freedom. When I'm saying that at the heart of our absolute desire for freedom, does that not mean, of course, that this desire for freedom is not violated, manipulated, or led astray? No, fundamentally, what we try to show is that the humans are characterized by absolute desire for freedom, and maybe 2, 3 characteristics that accompany this desire for freedom, which is our most precious gift. The first one is the creativity, the inventivity. What is fantastic in resistance is the individual creativity. An army, they can be inventive, but the invention is done by the strategist, and the soldier is going to obey the strategy and follow the strategy, which is, of course, laudable because it's at the peril of his life. But here, it's each individual invents. I was very marked by what I've heard about the first days of the Ukrainian resistance, where we would see elderly ladies, so they were about my age. They were throwing wool in the tank, in the fuel tank of the tanks. If you do this, you break down the engines. There was lots of tales from our parents or from the French resistance, where we see things that are invented by each individual in the name of the spirit of freedom. Say, I'm going to do this. And it's able to break down an entire army, and that is the optimistic message. I mean, my Ukrainian old lady that drops wool into a tank, she stops an entire column of tanks, and that is fantastic. That is the creativity. The other element is the pride, and that. I mean, all resistance, they are very modest. They don't want to avoid. It's the pride of doing it yourself. What is at the heart of the resistance is this: I'm going to do something what the collective, the state, the political community to which I belong is not able to do, or even worse, or has abandoned us, and we are going to, since they are not doing it, we are going to have to do it ourselves. And that is a humanist message, saying, I have to do this myself. You have abandoned us, so I'm going to have to do it myself. And the third idea is this approach that you see behind each of these images. My rights have been taken away from me or have been violated. I am not a human anymore if I let them take my rights away. We've seen this in Tiananmen. We've seen this in autumn, and we speak about it in autumn 2022 in Iran, when Mahsa Amini was assassinated and people went into the street. In the name of what? I mean, how you can condemn it to death because I have to wear or not wear a specific piece of cloth. That was also call for reflection. And so this reappropriation of the absolute right, that is an act of heroism in the countries. And that there's really 3 common denominators. I'm going to get back on this idea individual resistance, because you could say that there's no difference in Tiananmen. We all remember it's one person standing in front of a column of tanks. How do we keep a trace of these moments of resistance that really are markers of story. Yes, these are moments that are individual and collective at the same time. There's really this link between the individuum and the collective that I want to study, because it's not something that is obvious. Also, as Bertrand Badi mentioned, there's optimism that is not something that obvious, and commitment, motivation. And there's a word that is very important when you talk about resistance. It's courage. There is no resistance without a commitment around the idea of courage and bravery. So I would really congratulate Ina for this archive work, that it can only be resistance when there is commitment, when there is bravery, when there is courage. That is the first thing I wanted to say. To answer this question, to answer your question, in everything we have seen, in the images that we've seen now, that we've seen later on, at the core of, at the heart of each individuum, there's first an individual desire that goes towards the collective. At the heart of each individuum, who's committed, who's brave, there is this certainty that democracy can die, and that democracy can die. It's not something that is a natural law. There is no obviousness. Democracy can die. They can die because they're defeated by weapons. They can also be defeated by the electoral system, paradoxically, but they can also die because of the silence. As they say, democracy dies in darkness. It's because democracy needs to be saved. It's because democracy is not a natural law, that you need to individually commit and collectively commit to defend it, because silence, it's a form of being complicit with, and in all the images that we have seen, it's first of all a commitment to express yourself. That is what I see in all these images: the commitment, the courage, the bravery, the will to break the silence, because remaining silent means you support the oppressions or you participate in the oppressions. Yes, you can clap, absolutely. I was asking the question, how is it hard to choose between all, because you could spend hours. Yes, we are limited by the content. We always have to get back with the content, with the archives. Is that what we want to talk about? And there's what we can talk about. What we want to talk about and what we can talk about, there's a difference. This idea, what can we show? What do we want to prove? I find this very interesting, particularly when we work about memory and about history, we realize that history is also told by images, and it's particularly true for the younger generation. When you see something that happened, it does not have the same impact as when you heard it or you read about it. And when we went in the archives, the audiovisual archives of the INA, in order to tell this slow progression of resistance with the armed struggles, we asked ourselves, what do we have in terms of images to tell the war in Ukraine, for instance? We have, of course, the newsreels that are part of the INA. These were shot at a specific moment, and with war reporters who have some images, some minutes to show 4 images. I mean, you probably all look at the news on TV, so it's a very, very short sequences, a minute maximum. We're very far from a documentary or even a magazine format with 15, 20 minutes report. So we need to quickly seize the atmosphere with these images, but we do not have the images of the commands. We have the images that were broadcast, so we don't have all the reels, so we have to go through thematic research. I'm having to look at what we have on the Ukraine, on the French resistance, of course. Then we're going to have to look at other images, longer images sometimes, very beautiful images of the resistance to German occupation. And then we were limited on the Algerian independence war. We had not many images. What was interesting to us, what has France kept of these images that tell the history of the war in Algeria? Because, of course, France was not really interested in filming the conflict as we would have liked to see it today. So there's always this question, who is filming, who is behind the camera, and who has shot these images? What was he thinking? Why was he doing this? What was his motivation? What political discourse? Sometimes there's a collective unconscious. When you're a journalist, you're always biased, because you have an unconscious from your country. So always question what the image is telling, what is the message, and trying to edit it in such a way that it's historically fair without being too influenced by your own bias. As Bertrand said, and we mentioned at the beginning, the link with the resistance during the war in World War II. How do you establish that link? Is it a link where people decide to do things, or does it go deeper? Is it something that that is going to anchor itself in history and this link with the resistance movement? I mean, everyone is we know what a résistant is. Well, I just wanted to add something to what Eve said. It's true that there's not many images on the Algerian war, but considering my old age, I have some memories of that time. And there already was television back then, but it was extremely minority and not many people watching, and had not all the means that we have today. And the media, the only media was the radio. And I remember the radio reporter on the Algerian war and on the resistance that were, it was pathetic, because radio brings something, a mystery, because that the images then show. So when you would hear, I remember as if just as if it was yesterday, the report by Yves Courrière on when there was on the shooting on the when the troops opened fire on the Odyssey. You could hear the gunshots. You wouldn't see anything, but you had to imagine, and the imagined resistance is even stronger than the actual newsreel showing you the image. That is very important. Also for our socialization, this is something I remembered, and we talked about it with our neighbors. And to answer your question, it's very interesting indeed, because the resistance. Earlier on, you said quite rightly that the resistance is this meeting between the individual and collective sphere. I think that is very important. But to answer your question, you could go even a step further. It's a meeting between the individual and the history. It's very seldom to have the feeling that you're actually contributing to history. The resistance fighter, be it the resistance fighter in the World War II fighting the Nazi occupation, or the resistance fighter fighting for against colonialism. He is contributing to history. Of course, there were movements of resistance movement. There were strategists of there were also strategists of the resistance movement and theories of resistance. But each resistant is carrying its own piece of history, which means a lot. Which means first that history is not an elitist and minority movement. It's history, something done by everyone, positively or negatively. It also means this sublimation of the figure of the resistance, this mythical figure. Even though if he only contributes on a tiny level, he considers himself as being an actor, a stakeholder of history. I remember I met a certain number of resistance fighters of World War II. They were very modest, but nevertheless they were aware of the fact they at one moment participated in a moment in history. And what we show you is this ownership of history by individuals, which is a unique action. Of course, we have the revolutions that are the internal part of the resistance very often, the joint forces. We've seen this later on. But there's fundamentally this exception in the narration where we're told Vercingétorix, Louis XIV's Napoleon. But there, this is, allow me to say, it's really it's Joe, the average Joe, who participates in history, the anonymous participant. And that is something fascinating and very enthusiastic, but it's maybe at the heart of the social energy which we had mentioned earlier. Yes, absolutely, says Kléber. Resistance, it's actually an inversion of the meaning of history. Very often history is considered as being top-down, the leaders, the kings, the great leaders. And while the resistance inverses that viewpoint, this is seen at eye height by when we look at history from resistance, we are at the level of individuals, of the individuals. So the resistance, telling the resistance, is really looking at the history at human level and not through great leaders, but the story of average leaders. So prepare, brace yourself, because I'm going to ask a question, but then it will be your turn. How do you evaluate a resistance? Are there resistance movements that fail? Are there resistance movements that are a success? We have examples of resistance that have been here for a very long time. What is their use? How are they going to evolve? Somebody, how can we evolve this? How do we appreciate the value of a resistance? There's two ways of measuring that. One way that we spontaneously have is, what is the result? That's completely legitimate, but that's not what I'm interested in. I struggle for a subjective vision of history, and particularly of the world, history on a world stage. I am against those that say, look, the Arab Spring, it completely failed everywhere. Finally, a dictator replaced another dictator. That means you've completely misunderstood the human adventure. As soon as there's resistance, there's a victory. I had the privilege to teach in Cairo during a numerous years, before, during, and after the Tahrir Square revolution in 2011. I've seen my students, my male and female students, change. Suddenly they became aware, they suddenly emancipated themselves from the fear, from the prejudice, from the bias, from the imposed traditions. And that is already a fantastic victory. There is this internal aspect of the resistance, this fact that you overcome yourself, you emancipate yourself. Of course, that Marshal Admiral Sissi, it's just as bad as Hosni Mubarak. Yes, absolutely. But the young Egyptians, the young men and women Egyptians, they have changed. They have become major actors of the history. They do not forget what they did 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And the other ways of measuring the resistance is not, it's a victory of the defeat, is the transformative effect, the strong transformation of the human mentality. And that is fantastic. I think people who have gone through Tiananmen, they are not after 1989, they're like they were before. I have many information coming out of Iran showing that this society is suffering from a very violent repression. Nevertheless, they are more and more active. The volcano is boiling hotter and hotter. And so there is no going back. It's on a one-way street towards freedom. A one-way street towards liberty and contagion of the freedom and contagion of bravery. In all the reference that Bertrand mentioned, you have there's an extraordinary force. It is the force of the image, and I would like to establish the link between resistance and images and resistance and new technologies. Today, these images, they go in 10 seconds around the world, and it's not a solidarity of individuals. It is a worldwide solidarity that is built very quickly at a very, very fast pace, and it is a universal solidarity. These images coming out of Tehran, out of Cairo or elsewhere, they invade the world and they generate a universal solidarity. It's a speed at which it goes around the world. It's a strength with which is, and it's also something that you need to keep in mind when you talk about modern resistance. Even maybe on the image, that's interesting for you, because suddenly the image is at the heart with the internet tool. It's at the heart of these movements. Yes, actually what we're seeing is just about as important as what we're not seeing, meaning you always need to ask, why are there no images? And today we have a tendency of thinking that if you don't see it, it didn't happen, out of sight, out of mind. So there's so many images today that if I'm being told something and I can't see it, then you may doubt it, saying, you say maybe it didn't happen. Today there's resistance movements, typically which you can't show or difficult to show, particularly, for instance, spontaneously. The Russian resistance, for instance, against Putin's war. So the Russian citizens who were against Putin's war, I tried to find images that there were some parts of population that were opposing this war that were expressing themselves. They can't do it. There's no images, no traces. We tried the image of of that journalist who on TV pulled out a sign saying I am against this war and that it is Putin's war, not the Russian people's war. This image, we were not able to use it. It was complicated to find the sources, and it was also very expensive. We had to pay rights, so it tells something. Also means who has the control over the images, who's got the right to use it, to distribute it, under what conditions. So we always need to be careful. The image I'm seeing, is it because someone's interested in someone's interest to show me? You always need to ask yourself, where does the image come from? Who filmed it? So in the topic we showed on the use, there's a young man in Egypt who is absolutely marveling at the power he has. He said, I'm not a journalist, I'm just here, I'm just a student, I'm filming with my phone, and I'm filming in the minute I'm saying, I think there's police violence precise at this moment. There you see young man being evacuated who's been shot by the police. So there's this power of the image, but you always need to ask yourself, what is it we do not see, and why do we not see the importance of the image and the source, the origin of the image that is important for journalists. We're going to open the audience for questions. Are there any questions? Okay, the woman just next to you. Yes, thank you.
Good evening, thank you. Amélie Turner. I had a two-part question. First of all, in this notion of individual bravery, which then links to the collective bravery, sometimes is this lack of consciousness, or is this an energy also of despair? Because I was a reporter in some difficult countries, and sometimes you kind of wonder about that. Another question, a little bit more of an ironic question, should we learn to resist images themselves as well?
Je vais aller un peu dans votre sens, mais ça...
Yes, I'd agree with you in a way. That's what I was trying to say. We need to be careful with the power of images nowadays. We need to be careful and think about the interest that certain institutions and people might have when they're showing us images. I think this work of seeing how the images were found, why we chose such an image, this is very important. Because we consume images nowadays, that's where we are in society. We see a lot of images all the time. So we're not always in a situation where we ask where the image came from, who filmed it, who approved it, why you show me this one. With other images, they decide not to show me. So you have to have a critical mind. And this is very much important nowadays because there are fake news out there, fake information out there. So we have to be careful in terms of what we see and how we see it. In terms of the role of museums, let me talk a little bit about the Con Memorial. We need to be able to learn how to read images. And that's the role of museums, helping teach people to understand how to learn how to read images and analyze them, because they're never neutral. So it's our role in museums to help people to analyze and provide context to images. So you're right, yes, we need to be able to fight against images in a way. So we need to be able to understand them and therefore need to learn how to read them. In terms of this question of this lack of consciousness or despair, what do you have to say? Yes, I'm not going to go against you, but I would like to provide a nuance to what my colleagues here on the panel just said. An image also talks about yourself. It also talks about the person who is looking at the image. The older I get, I'm getting pretty old, the more I believe that in social life we're always really subjective. If you put 10 people in front of the same image, they will not see it and understand it in the same way. Of course, you have to be careful, and this is another important thing nowadays, fake images. We know that there are certain modern techniques to create fake images. But I think all of us should have free interpretation of images. That should be freedom. This is completely normal. It is profoundly human to have varied and different interpretations of images. And if you try this with a group of friends, you will see. It's very surprising. That was just an anecdote, just a comment to add to this. In terms of lack of consciousness or despair, I understand your powerful question. Let me allow you to think back to yesterday's plenary session, if you were there, when Oksana Midashuk said something really interesting. She said that the choice to resist is almost about calculating the costs. How useful will it be? Thinking, would it not be worse if I do not take action, if I do not resist? A Ukrainian, do they really have the choice between resisting or not resisting? She says no. We have no choice, because not resisting would be putting yourself in a situation which would be worse, even more of a nightmare than their brave commitment to the cause. So I understand why you're talking about a lack of consciousness, but she said that I never thought of things in this way. She thought of things in a very rational way. It's rational to take risks, because the risk that you're taking significant risks, of course. But in these people's minds, these risks are lower, less significant than the option of not fighting back. So that was an interesting way of seeing things. And maybe that explains why people do take up arms. Because how many of us sometimes feel disgusted, but then eventually we don't do anything because we say it's going to be a huge risk, so I should be rational and take a backward step. And sometimes we are being cowards doing this. But the way she was thinking about it was also a rational way of thinking. So that's something we should really think about, I would say. It's something that's subconscious. I don't imagine she didn't write down the pros and cons. But in our minds, is this idea of thinking, well, it's less of a risk taking up arms rather than just letting history decide my fate. That's why I always think that people do think about things consciously. People are brave. Kleber said this just now, and I agree with him. People are committing, but also people are quite rational on an individual level. Yes, people are being rational, but at the same time, sometimes you go beyond being just rational. I think in the heroism of resistance, they sacrifice themselves in a way. So yes, it's a rational choice. Sometimes, Bertrand, I agree, but sometimes it goes beyond something just rational. And that's when people take a sacrifice. Could we have another question from the room? There's a question in the middle of the room, please. Good afternoon. Yes, you talked about the power of images, and we need to be aware of this and take measures. I just wanted to talk about the words of terrorism and resistance. Think about the words themselves. In the images you showed some resistance who, in the places where they live, they are called terrorists. So we need to be careful in terms of the words we use. So I think we should always bear in mind that use can be used for certain purposes. It's an excellent question, Bertrand Badi. We see that sometimes, yeah, there's an instrumentalization of resistance. You've asked a great question. My father was part of the French resistance, and the French resistance were called terrorists when they were there fighting at the time. And during the war in Algeria, the Algerian resistance were called terrorists back then as well. So yes, the semantic confusion is overwhelming. Sometimes students when you talk about explaining to them what a terrorist is, you say it's a resistant that you don't like. There is absolute terrorism, a blind terrorist who blindly attacks civilians, that attacks children, people that cannot defend themselves. I think we could all agree that such people would be deemed terrorists. But fundamentally, I rarely use the word terrorist because it's difficult to define other than saying that it's the resistant that we do not like. Yes, just to follow up on that, we talked about ideological images just now, but words themselves are also ideological. Thank you very much. We don't have much time, so let's now move on to the second part of our debate, talking about women who are fighting. So, Ev, how are we going to organize this? We'll see the second episode first and foremost.
Tout au long du XXe siècle,
Throughout the 20th century, women demanded their rights and obtained their rights. By obtaining the right to vote, they became fully fledged citizens. Little by little, they made society more egalitarian. The fight for the emancipation of women. But nothing can never be deemed to have been fully acquired. The struggle continues to evolve. It must continue to evolve.
l'année de
Shame on you. In 2022, there was a crossroads in the history of women and women's rights. In the US, they repealed the law on the right to abortion, and thus took the decision to ban it in certain states. I was able to abort in the past, and I would like my daughter to have the same right. I cannot imagine living in a country where we do not respect our rights, and that is what is happening right now.
quelques mois plus tard,
A few months later, in Iran, young women aged 22 years old died after 3 days of struggles. This event led to an uprising in the country. None to the compulsory veil. We want freedom, freedom to dress as we would like to.
Laissez-nous enlever ce voile.
Please let us take off the veil. I would like our government to consider me as an Iranian woman of her time, of the modern age. This uprising follows a century of debates regarding the veil in Iran. And it was made compulsory in 1969. In 1979, sorry. Elsewhere across the globe, other women mobilized to defend their freedoms. Since the revelations of the Me Too movement started in 2017, new generations of feminists are demanding the end of sexual and sexist violence against women in France. Young women are more aware of this now. We are the generation of Me Too. I see that there is desire, this anger amongst young women nowadays. This movement made me realize I'm not on my own and that I can stand up and fight.
les colères d'aujourd'hui font écho au combat des
The anger now echoes the anger of the French MLF movement. We are striking to show what would happen if we stopped. If I stopped looking after my husband and stopped working around the home, what would happen? There are different waves of women's struggle. Today, thousands and millions of women are fighting against practices and laws which restrict their rights, a resistance in the form of resilience.
Bravo, parce que c'est vrai que c'est pas simple à réaliser.
Bravo, it's true it's not easy to make these types of documentaries. I was paying close attention, and you can see that there are close links between past events and present events. How did you organize things to put together this episode? Well, yes, it was inspired by the realization that things were repeating themselves, or maybe stuck in a circle. It was important to remind people that the right to vote was given to women only quite recently. When you look at history in the long term, over the long term. So we wanted to focus on what's happening today in Iran, in the US. Looking back at the images, it stood out what we said earlier, that the source of the images is very clear here, that the people filmed with the nice images, the protests in the US, because everything is easy to film. Because these women are speaking freely. They're coming to protest with their children. They have their signs with them. And then with Iran, it was images on the phone, images that we got from the internet. We were able to access these images, but the quality is not the same because the context in the different countries were not the same. So that really stood out to me then. And so, yes, I wanted to go full circle with Paris and the protests which are continuing in our country. Sometimes you have the impression that you are repeating old demands. It's only a short episode, but I really wanted to hear from some of the women speaking. There's lots of anger. There was lots of anger in different forms of resistance. And on this topic, you could really hear this anger, feel this anger. We talked about resilience at the end here. An angry resilience, a resilient form of anger, if you will. But I wanted this anger to be heard. So that's why we kept a lot of interviews with women in this episode. Shouldn't you just pass the mic to anybody, no particular representatives of an institution, but just to anybody in the street that's come out to the protest. And it was quite striking to note that this is happening again. You're talking about things going full circle, that sometimes things are repeating themselves. That's the impression you have. You kind of feel like we've not really made much progress. I would like to say that we have made lots of progress. Looking at these images with you, I was thinking to myself, there's a universality of women's struggles. And this understanding of the universal nature of women's struggles is something quite new. This is something new, this understanding that women's rights and women's freedoms is something universal. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the photos of Iran, the sources that you were able to find and publish here. If you visited Iran a few years ago, even quite recently, I've been there, and I went there on a personal trip, believing that only women could change the regime in Iran. I was not really surprised by recent events in the country. Women in Iran, Iranian women, are highly educated. They have a high level of education in in Iran. Bertrand, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but when the level of education rises, I think revolution will be close in such regimes. And I'm convinced that it's thanks to women that things will change in Iran. And that is how we need to look at Iranian society and the Iranian regime. Bertrand Badi, the weight of women's role in Iran is really surprising, isn't it? Yes, I would say that I agree. I would maybe present things in a slightly different way. What strikes me when I looked at this excellent clip was again the similarities in very different situations. The similarities come in three different ways. First of all, something that we should not forget, that before there's a resistance, there's a feeling of humiliation, and the humiliation of women is when women realize that men have been dominating for centuries and centuries. And this domination is to deny existence to women, that she is naturally, spontaneously dominated. It's the worst form of domination, this mass domination that is presented as being just normal, natural. When domination is evident in this way, clear in this way, it is doubly dominant thanks to repression and dominant thanks to symbolism. And humiliation is the driver of history, and this is important to note, and it's not just in the women's struggle. Slaves felt the same thing. The colonized countries felt the same things. And there's also an idea amongst women's resistance that they want to take back control of their bodies. That's why the question of abortion is so important, to realize that it took centuries for us to give women the right to take their own decisions about their own bodies. And it's been shown quite clearly that abort, yes, is at the center of everything, but there are other signs of how women want to take back control of their bodies. In France, we are talking about this clothing that women wear in schools. But what about the clothing men wear? There are certain markers. The problem of our societies is the way in which women are dressed. What about how men dress? What about their hair? What about if the abaya is a religious marker? What about the other 30, 40 markers that men can wear in their clothing, when have in their appearance? Why is it always about women? Why is that the only thing that shows in the debate? I have Iranian origin, Persian origin. I always dreamed that in the country of my father, women that don't want to wear the veil don't have to, and in this country, they can if they want to, but it's always women. It's always women.
La femme qui est le symbole.
It's always women that are the symbol of domination, the marker of domination. And my third point now, where I am close to my friends' opinions, behind the matter of the veil in Iran, there is the instrumentalization of women, political instrumentalization of women, and also the idea to impose a political marker. The Ayatollah Khomeini doesn't really care about whether they're wearing veils or not. It's just a direct challenge. It's a political matter. And that is the reason why, yes, of course, the great bravery from women when there was the assassination, very quickly, women in Iran were joined by men, children, old people, workers, ethnic minorities. And why? Because they all understood that via this attack with the veil, it was a symbol of domination. That was a key topic for the Iranians and their new struggles. And the strength of women nowadays is that they fight for their rights, but they are also fighting against the spirit of domination itself.
Merci, Bertrand Badi.
Thank you very much, Bertrand Badi. Following up on what you just said, I would like to talk a little bit about the Me Too movement. It's something which has changed lots of markers. Maybe Eve, first of all, on this topic. It's not something that is anecdotal. It's really having an impact on society. How can we look at it? Well, there's something very interesting in my work on Me Too. It's very difficult to provide images about it because it's people taking stances often on social media, women saying on social media, Me Too, I was raped, and people tried to do this to me, etc. And it's difficult to get images. It's hard to tell a story in images about this. So there are women that will say to you that this happened to me. It doesn't really reflect the mass of stories heard during Me Too, and it also shows the limits of the image form. I really thought about how, in a documentary based on archives, how can I really tell a story of Me Too? Well, you can't. Would there not be one story which could represent things? Yes, but you lose the mass side of things. I think that was the mark of Me Too, that it was what really surprises about the movement. that there was so many stories. So just having one story, I felt we lost the mass aspect to it. So that was a key challenge. So Me Too is mentioned, but we don't really show images about it. We then turned back to protests in Paris. So yes, it was following on from Me Too, but it's difficult to try and depict this type of movement. And I think during these digital debates, it's difficult to try and find and depict it, how to depict it in images. How can we keep the trace of the Me Too movement? Do you have any ideas? How can we transmit it through the generations, through the years? Well, I got a two-part answer. First of all, Me Too was when a domino effect of people feeling free to express themselves. So one person starts to speak out and everybody else follows. So we talked about the individual and collective. So it's always the same approach. One person speaks up and then everybody else. So that's a dynamic that we need to understand and analyze that as well. So for a historian, Bertrand, you tell me if you disagree, but for me, we have to look at how to preserve this memory, this heritage, and that's not easy to do because it's all very fluid. As Ev was saying just now, it's difficult to conserve the images. Sometimes there are no images. So this movement was a universal movement. And you should understand it as a universalization of the female condition. It's a challenge for those who are analyzing history in the long term, and for people like me as directors of museums who try to conserve this memory of history. So it'll be a challenge for us historians and for us museum directors. It's a challenge in terms of how we can interpret, understand, and conserve this heritage. But what we should remember, I believe, is that the most important thing is that what one person's voice breaks through, other people then follow and speak out. So is it a challenge for you in terms of understanding movements like Me Too? Yes, I was delighted to see Me Too represented in this film. I'm delighted that you portrayed Me Too via demonstrations and protests. Protests are really important. When you look at the news at 8 o'clock in France and you see protests, all we ever focus on is a number of people that have been at the protest according to the police, or the number of people that were there according to NGOs, and looked at one of the cars which have been vandalized. But that's not the key thing about protests. What is a protest? It is making visible in the public area a phenomenon which is sometimes quite individual. So this transition from the individual to the collective, from the invisible, almost invisible, to something which is absolutely visible, and something which is mediatized, it is something which takes resistance to the next level. Why do you think that trade unions, associations, etc., insist always on organizing protests? And it's a risk for them because sometimes you never know how it will happen, how it will go, if it will be a fiasco, etc. Well, why do they do it? Because it's thanks to protests that a topic is really brought to the public attention, brought into the public space. According to my lived experience, I would say that Me Too had a huge impact on the Arab Spring. And that's something which people don't tend to talk about because there's censorship on Egyptian television. They decided not to censor images of Me Too. And they thought, well, Arab communities, conservative societies, and this will not impact us. So that was false. They were wrong. And Me Too had a key impact, first of all, on the terms of the visibility, but also due to the strength of this slogan itself. I don't know who invented this hashtag, but it included everybody. If you're a victim, well, me too.
Je connais le moins mal.
I'll talk about myself. I was a victim of bullying when I was a child, but then we didn't really talk about bullying. You weren't allowed to talk about it. But what is extraordinary is that people take such a step and say, what happens to me? What happened to me one day, and actually may have happened to many other people. So becoming aware, this has a key role in terms of the female condition. Me Too was an extraordinary movement. Women didn't know that what happened to them in their private lives, individual lives, maybe has happened to many other people all across the globe on the other side of the world. So you can see here that the issue of visibility and solidarity are really key drivers of history. Such like decolonialization happened in 1947 in India, and like domino effect, over 13 years up to 1960, another 60 countries followed, and that's something absolutely extraordinary. You never talk about decolonialization. It's forbidden, you know. Maybe people would sanction me. Fortunately, I'm a pensioner now, so people can't really get at me. But, you know, people say it's a moment in the history that we don't want to talk about. But I'd like to talk about it. It was a huge change in the history of the world. And this change happens at such rapid speed. 13 years in the history of humanity, it's nothing at all. It's a very short period of time, but it was due to visibility, identification with others. If Indians took the risk to stand up against the British colonialists, well, for me in Guinea or Algeria, well, I'll stand up against the French as well.
Okay, just to answer and reassure Bertrand, yes, indeed, museums, they speak about decolonization, and the museum I am in charge of, the Memorial of Caen, it's thinking about a specific pathway on these decolonization wars that have led the world towards Cold War. Yes, historians are now discussing the issue of decolonization because it's a founding issue. And I would like to get back to Me Too, and then, of course, the audience can ask questions. There is one aspect in Me Too which you need to remember, is there is a progression of the rule of law. Rule of law. The rule of law is taking up the issue of equality, and everywhere in the countries you see a progression of the rule of law and of rights, and that is an important element. And this right is a protecting rule of law and a universal rule of law. Are there any questions from the audience?
Il y en a une juste là.
There's one here. Please get up. I would like to get back on something that you said. I don't want to contradict you. You said that it was the woman's job to fight and to resist against the violence and the rapes and all that. How do you motivate young women and women when we know that we're in a government that is mainly led by men, considered of men, and the only questions they have regarding the women, it's the chador, the veil, and the religious and the wearing of abaya in high schools. How can you motivate young women knowing that the government does not hear our voices? And sorry if I'm. There are not many politicians have expressed, for example, the issue of on rape, on sexual and sexist violence at work, on the workplace, or even within the home, domestic rape. How can we give hope to young women to continue to fight, to struggle?
C'est à la fois une question sur...
It is at the same time a question on the lack of representation and mobilization of political forces. How can we ensure to change the state of mind, the situation? First of all, you are absolutely right. to highlight a dimension that we have not mentioned yet. There are many, of course, which we have not. There is a perverse effect. It's the instrumentalization of the double bias, say, change and interpretation of the question of the abaya, of the chador, making an element of action on the public opinion. There are two intolerable things as far as human rights is. First of all, is to force someone to get dressed, a young woman who would be forced against her will to wear this or that piece of it. And that is the responsibility of the state to defend that person that is dominated in such a way by her community or by her family. And the other would be to make this piece of cloth an instrument of religious proselytism and political propaganda. But outside of that, we have the right not just to dress just as you want, but we also have the right to interpret your piece of cloth, your clothing the way you want to. For many years, I was a teacher in Cairo, and sometimes, after knowing my students, my female students, and talking about their clothing, and I realized that there was tons of reasons to wear this. Some people say, "Oh yeah, I like this fashion." There's fashion stores in Cairo that sell different types of chadors, of niqab. Others said it's a family tradition. I'm doing it because my other was saying, "Well, for me, it's easier. It allows me to get around more easily in the street and maintain a certain intimacy." There's tons of different interpretation, and I think that the most perverse domination is the one that ignores the meaning that the other gives to us and imposes its own meaning just because this is my vision is the proper one. And then indeed there is an obligation to resist. Then you ask another question which is very serious, which is the question of harassment. This question of the harassment, for having very modestly lived through it, but having heard the best ally of the harasser, of the bully, is the silence of the person being bullied, and that is terrible. That is the super social control. It means you dominate, and at the same time you give the other the feeling of shame of resisting the domination. It's the inverse humanity, and that it is not sufficiently said, it is not sufficiently proclaimed. The true resistance, we have not mentioned it yet, and it's good that you asked it. The true resistance is the speaking out, is not being afraid of speaking out and denouncing the affront that you have lived. And the strength of the aggressor is the silence of the victim and feels humiliated by speaking out against the aggression. That is the true problem. Thank you, Bertrand Badi.
Une autre question.
Another questions? Thank you. I am part of the Me-Too generation. We grew up as a young person with this representation of the body of the woman. We reappropriate our body, but today the struggle is it's in all the spheres of society, and it's even more in the family sphere, because it's also an intergenerational struggle with generations that do not understand this reappropriation of the body. Sorry, I want to choose my words wisely. In the government, even, we have a majority of men, and also men of another generation who do not have the notion of the struggles that we are fighting. And today we have the impression that we need to fight against the entire society, even among our own generation. So how can we fight without offending? How can we move forwards without having the feeling of being hysteric? Sometimes as soon as we have some ideas, we are called hysteric. Thank you. Thank you, because it's a perfect transition with And next time, we
On n'a pas évoqué cette...
we have not mentioned this generational issue. It's true that it's something that plays a role in here, clearly how can we deal with this? You said earlier, Bertrand Badi, we dominate and we impose to the victims of silence. Here there's sometimes generations that do not understand. How do we establish the link? Well, I think it's always in the same logic. This absolute domination that consists in imposing your own meaning, your own way of viewing, your own code, your own understanding to everybody else. You need to understand things the way I'm, and if you do not understand what I mean, then you're transgressive, which is really the absolute maximum domination. And the generation effect, you're absolutely right to underline it, to say we are in a society that is even unconsciously super conservative. We are in a society where it becomes absolute rule to not change anything of what we have learned yesterday and day before yesterday. I see it international, as an international, I see it every day. We look at the world in 2023 the way we looked at it in 1950, because this is how we were educated when we grew up, or this is what we learned in school. Who himself belonged to the previous generation. So this is extremely dangerous. This is conservatism is extremely dangerous. Look at, I mean, we're kind of just look at the Nigerian crisis was treated in France, just as we would have treated it in 1950. Ever since, many things have changed since 1950s. The world has changed since 1950. When you say the world has changed, people say, "Oh, you are a lefty Islamist." If I could maybe just add something, it's not my role because I'm just a journalist, but I just wanted to answer to the young women because I think the topics are linked. To speak about you need to raise your voice, as what Mr. Badi was saying, and speak up, and also maybe film, create the image. Of course, I preach for my own choir. It's important that young people today film and that tell the world the way they see it. But when you tell the world the way you see it, then you are going to touch your neighbor, and they say, "Oh, I see the world like this too." And suddenly we have a common voice that emerges as above, and that represents a whole generation. That is also something that happened. We need create images, maybe an idea of a new documentary. So the transition is, get together and talk about yourselves. And now we transition over to another episode that is dedicated to the planet, and we're going to realize that the young generations are very motivated this. So this is the third episode of the INA web series. Beyond the borders, a common destiny links the men and women on the planet Earth. Climate change are generating new forms of conflict. They make communities more vulnerable, and they make inequalities even worse. And they also worsen the conflicts. They require full attentions. More and more citizens decide to resist faced with the inactions of the governments in terms of climate. In order to alert, they occupy the places of power and the media in order to mobilize as many people as possible. Civil resistance, like Martin Luther King and Gandhi have done. And I cannot deny what's going on in the world. Our method has worked for other struggles, like the women's rights or some decolonial movements. These actions intervene as the CNICC, the international group on the IPPCC on the climate, is publishing reports that are more and more alarming, without this having any radical changes for our government action. These voices, sometimes very young, say that the future of our children happens today, and it's completely irresponsible to wait. What is going to stay is going to be the biggest failure in the history of humanity. The incapacity of the government to face the climate risks already has an impact on the stability and the security of the states and on peace. The degradation of the environment, poverty, hunger, and conflicts are closely linked. According to a UN report published in 2023, the number of people in severe food insecurity has tripled in 6 years. 1 people out of 9 suffers from hunger around the world, a situation that is going to get even worse with the modification of climate and the water scarcity. These convictions have already guided the combat of Wangari Maathai. In 1977, this biologist, she created in Kenya the Green Belt movement, and she's led Kenyans to plant more than 50 million trees to fight against soil erosion. Water, forests, food, and even the air we breathe, they are common goods. And if we manage these common goods in a reasonable and responsible way, if we share them in a fair way, then we'll have the luck to survive. In India, it's another woman, Vandana Shiva, who has made a core of her struggle the defense of the peasant. She founded an eco-responsible farm. She fights for food sovereignty via responsible agriculture. The pressure of the industrial agriculture, GMOs, chemical things, the globalization, this is what's destroying the farmers. Since the Larzac Plateau and the first struggles for the defense of agricultural lands, the struggles today are around the fundamental defense of our resources. Taking good care of the planet that feeds us is the best way to ensure the future. It's an urgent resistance.
Beaucoup de choses dans...
Lots of things in this documentary. I have a first question, and then we look at the topics. We were talking about the young. When making this episode, have you discovered new ways of resistance with the younger generation? Are there new tools of struggle that are being reapproached? I would say, yes, we can hear it, and some people who say where they are doing a die-in, Place de la Concorde in Paris, we are inspired of Gandhi. It basically closes the loop. We have the impression that the resistance formats, people really take them up, depending on the context and there's many activists today for climate who speak about non-violence. I think this is an interesting approach. It means that here again, that the ideas are transversal and they basically jump from one topic to the other. I didn't want just to talk about the young people, but there's also people who are not young and who fight for these climate issues. But I also wanted to reflect this feeling that many young people have is that the only ones to lead the struggle in their family, and they're being confronted with the feeling that that beyond their small bubble, their contemporary, their friends and kin, the danger is not taken seriously at the seriousness they think it should be taken into account of. It's a very rich topic. We also will talk about food and security. There's many topics. Yeah, Kleber Harold, when we look at the documentary, we also have an approach on this planetary urgency. Yes, it's a planetary resistance, but at the same time, there's local initiatives, which we've seen. So we're in this global, local dimensions. How do you take that up? Because it's a resistance that concerns everyone around the world. If you're slightly smart, you understand that there's issues based on the planet. How, at the individual level, we can make the difference? First of all, a huge failure, we have to admit, a huge failure, and some lights of hope. A huge failure is that for the past 20 years, the IPCC is alerting all the persons responsible on the risks that the climate that we're going to face. It's a huge failure. It's for 20 years, no policy, no global policy, consistent long-term policy has been developed. That's a huge failure, and this failure at one stage we'll have to pay for it, and we'll have to analyze it. And faced with this failure, there are some lights of hope, as you said earlier. It's all the initiatives we have seen in Kenya, with Vandana Shiva in India, with people I noted. It's mainly women, again. It's not by chance. There is a commitment, a local commitment in Kenya, in India, and elsewhere. I'm thinking about South America, and very strong initiatives in Brazil that really anchor the local actions to fight against the failure, the absolute failure, the patent failure as far as the global management of the climate urgency has been done. Well, I mean, and when I said at the beginning that democracies can die, I think people are aware that the planet can die, and that is what is going to mobilize the new generations. It's a huge aspect of mobilization and commitment. I wouldn't speak about resistance, I would speak about commitment, engagement. And this engagement has a universal aspect because we realize with the images that we've seen today that it's the entire planet that is concerned. And at the scale of a generation, it's not something theoretical. At the scale of a lifetime, today we see this despair, this disarticulation of the climate issue. Bertrand Badi, you as a historian, do you see this planetary resistance, this failure also? How do you see all this? Because we are in a moment that is extremely important. Yes, you are right to raise the issue in this terms. With this last sequence, we are entering a resistance, a new form of resistance. Why a new form of resistance? If we look at the beginning of our meeting, we were speaking with the first forms of resistance that we have analyzed during the war, decolonization, speaking about a refusal to absolutely of domination, something that touches you in your own private self. And here we discover a new threat, and we are completely bringing together all the humanity. It's the first resistance that unifies and brings together everyone. And it's so new that you don't even realize it. We're talking about terrorism earlier. Terrorism is each year between 10 and 40,000 deaths. The hunger in the world, it's 9 million deaths per year. That means the equivalent of four World Trade Center attacks per day, as if every 6 years a plane would fly into the World Center the entire year. Climate change, it's 8 million people per year. Very difficult to calculate, and you see what sanitary insecurities. All this is new, but now from now on articulates the individual resistance to the global interest. It's a new word, the global interest, the common interest, and that requires an extraordinary effort, because those who resist in the name of this global interest needs to completely change its own software. So you need to get used to a world in which national security will be behind the global security, because we in France will only be safe if the world is safe. How safe could we be at the national level, a national interest, if elsewhere climate change threatens the entirety of the planet? That is a heroic in a certain way, and it's fantastic to see that young people, NGOs, new NGOs, that women take the initiative this way of a completely unknown struggle. There is no model. We have never done that before. This new form of global resistance, it does not have any limits. There is no precedence. It's being invented as we advance. I think that shows that we live a very important sequence of humanity in the history of humanity. And second, it's a huge uncertainty. It's not something we might fail, because the governance, they are talking lots of hot air, fantastic formulas. They probably paid a lot for communication agencies. Our house is burning, but we're looking elsewhere. That is very nice. It's almost Victor Hugo. It's almost literature. But what has it changed in reality in our polities? And this inversion going from global interest now goes before the national interest. That nothing has been done. Nothing is done to apply this. and implement this.
Kleber-Raoul, peut-être.
Kleber-Raoul, what really I note is that we're talking about a global threat, where we kind of the impression, as Bertrand Baptiste, is that the governments, maybe they know, they are aware of it, but what brings them to, what makes it, why are we still have a failure? Maybe we should ask the governments that, not to me, I'm not at the government. What I'm doing is at my level is I can see that the wars of today and the wars of tomorrow are already wars that are linked to the climate issue. The wars of tomorrow, the wars of today, they're linked to issues like access to water, access to food, access to space, to land. And when I look at this issue of climate change through the issue of the new conflicts emerging, how can we think a global order on this issue of new conflicts, where the issue is raised? How am I going to feed my population? How this population going to access to water? How they're going to access to health? That are the challenges we need to meet. Yes, we have in front of us a completely global topic that goes beyond the borders, a question that we've talked about a lot. These questions now behind us, these old questions, now we need to think about the universality of this urgency, the urgency that is really what they say on the question of urgency. The conflicts are going to catch up with us, and there we are going to reach something that is irreversible. How do you manage irreversibility in a theoretical time? That is a theoretical question many public authority will have to be forced to answer. Eve speaks about global challenges, but you also took two examples. Yeah, we wanted to instill some hope, some positive things that say that we all could act. I have worked a lot on these issues of climate challenges and climate change. It's very difficult to illustrate that with images. When you look, it's lots of passivity on one hand, a fairly silent demonstration. There's less this anger that we've seen on the women's rights. Here there is a more kind of form of this that they basically admit that they're powerless, which I think is even reinforced this idea that you see, talking about climate change, we need to show images that are hurtful, forests burning, icebergs falling into the sea, and all these things that are very shocking, all these shocking images, they're in complete opposition to the quietness of these huge meetings of the COP21 and COP25 and all this. So these we only have 5 minutes left, so we're trying to take two questions in the audience. Maybe first line here, there's someone, and over there, one here, and the young woman who's over here. So these will be our two questions. Hello, I have a question. Do you think that in 50 years after the climate change will be twice as high or not?
Alors, ça c'est une question pour des climatologues.
That is a question for climatologists. This is for the IPCC. I can just answer on this question. The month of September 2023 in France has been the hottest month for the past 100 years. This is already a first answer to your question. And the second answer, it's true that these climate events, these extreme climate events, are more and more numerous and more often. We can't predict what is going to happen in 50 years, but I'm not sure. I had a question. In the high school, we speak a lot about environment, in biology, in physics, in business class. But when we see that the political authorities do not act, just like or they do not follow the IPCC or the COPs that are very much on paper but not much in results, what effects what are they expecting from us by talking to us about environment and ecology? At the end, we always hear the same things. After a while, we give up. What are they expecting from us? Yes. The governments who do not react, what are they expecting? What are they waiting? What are they waiting for the young people to change the situation? Yeah, that's interesting. when I was a student, not very long time ago, well, you're laughing. When I was a student, the word environment did not exist. We said, oh yeah, environment, that's what's around. Then within about 10 years in the 1970s, there was suddenly an awareness. The public opinion and the scientific community, not just the people in the street, outside of the governmental spheres, they built the issue of climate. This, from your age, you can't understand that. You're too young that. I've seen this happen live, going from ignorance to unconscious and from the unconscious to conscious. That is a giant step already, that we can say this, that we can be aware of this, what we call in social sciences, becoming conscious. That is a first step. Of course, then there is a second stage that is far more difficult, which is indeed the translation of this awareness raising in concrete and difficult decisions. Because they can't be solitary anymore. Even if somebody, a saint would be governing France, and we're far from it, then he wouldn't be able to do everything could only be efficient if it's a collective action. But don't forget that there are two engines in the history. First, the fear, and the second is the profit. These are the two engines that can get people to move. When you're afraid to say, okay, let's give up our national egoism to create something that is reassuring. You know, fear, it's what has allowed us to achieve many things in the history of the international relations. Let's create the two multinationals in the Society of Nations after World War I, in the UN after World War II. The other one is the desire for profit. This awareness raisers work will be strong enough that they go and say, okay, it's in our interest. Maybe it would be good for us to take strong measures in terms of global security. Well, here we have not yet been scared enough and not been aware enough of how we could profit. I thought that the COVID would scare people so much, would so much make people that we will be able to make money, profit financially from having a global sanitary governance. I thought we were going to make this. We have not even moved forward 1 millimeter. So maybe we need a COVID that is 10 times stronger, and a summer 2023 times 100 for people to become aware and react. That will be the last. I would like to thank the Forum for Peace, thank Bertrand Badi, Clément Roux, and Eve Minot for this fantastic panel. We could have spoken 3-5 hours. Thank you to all of you, and bye-bye.